My in-laws encouraged my wife to leave and promised her financial support during divorce. I stayed silent, activated the Asset Protection Trust, and finalized my equity transfers. They stopped returning her calls when the court denied temporary alimony based on our signed agreement. We want you to know that Nicole doesn't have to stay in this marriage if she's unhappy. Gerald said that to my face, sitting in my own living room, on my couch, drinking the coffee I made. I didn't say a word. I just set my mug down slowly on the table, looked him directly in the eyes, and nodded once. He must have taken that as defeat. He must have thought the silence meant I was broken. He had no idea that I had already made 3 phone calls that morning before they arrived. One to my attorney, one to my financial advisor, one to the trustee managing what was about to become a very different kind of estate. Gerald thought he was delivering a blow. He had no idea he was standing at the starting line of something he wouldn't understand until it was far too late. Hey viewers, before we move on to the video, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button if you want to see more stories like this. I'm 39 years old. I've been married for 6 years to a woman I genuinely loved. We live in a suburb outside of Charlotte, North Carolina, in a house I purchased before we ever met, in a city I built a life in through a decade of quiet, deliberate work. And for the last 8 months, that life had been slowly dismantled from the inside. Not by a dramatic affair, not by some catastrophic argument, but by something far more insidious. By a family that decided their daughter could do better, and a wife who started to believe them. Nicole and I met at a work conference 6 years before all of this happened. She was in marketing. I was in commercial real estate acquisitions. We were opposites in the way that initially seems exciting and eventually becomes friction. She liked spontaneity. I liked structure. She spent freely. I planned carefully. We made it work for a while because I genuinely respected her energy and she genuinely admired what I had built. But somewhere around year 3, the dynamic shifted. Her parents, Gerald and Diane, started coming around more. Every visit left Nicole slightly more dissatisfied with something. The house wasn't decorated the right way. I worked too many hours. I was too focused on finances. I didn't express myself emotionally the way Nicole needed. And every time I tried to address these concerns directly, I get a version of the same answer. My parents just want what's best for me. I used to believe that was true. The first time I really saw what was happening was about 14 months before Gerald showed up in my living room. Nicole and I had just gotten back from a dinner with her parents. Normal evening, or so I thought. We were getting ready for bed, and she went quiet in that particular way she had when she was rehearsing something in her head. I asked her what was wrong. She said, "Do you ever think we rushed into this?" I remember standing there with a toothbrush in my hand, just staring at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. Rushed into what? I asked. Marriage, she said. This life. All of it. I put the toothbrush down. I asked her if something had happened at dinner. She said no, but her mother had called her that afternoon, and I could see the residue of that conversation all over her face. I didn't press it that night. I should have, because what I didn't know then was that Diane had already begun a months-long campaign to convince Nicole that she was settling, that she could have more, that a woman with her looks and personality deserved someone who would lavish her with attention and never say no to anything. What Diane was actually describing was not a husband. It was a wallet with a personality disorder. But Nicole was listening. Over the next several months, I noticed things I had been too close to see clearly before. Every time we had a disagreement, Nicole called her mother before we even resolved it between ourselves. Every time I made a financial decision, no matter how sound, there was a comment waiting. Dad says that's not how you build real wealth. Gerald, by the way, had filed for bankruptcy twice. He ran a landscaping company that had never turned a meaningful profit. But he had opinions about my commercial real estate portfolio that he delivered with complete confidence. I started documenting things around that time. Not out of paranoia, just out of instinct. I've always been someone who keeps records. In real estate, you learn quickly that verbal agreements are just conversations. Paper is what protects you. So I started keeping a log. Dates, what was said, by whom, in what context. I kept it simple and factual. I didn't know then how important that document would become. About 8 months before Gerald's visit, Nicole told me she wanted to separate. Not divorce. Separate. She said she needed space to figure out who she was. I asked her if she had been talking to a therapist. She said she had been talking to her mother. I told her I thought she should talk to a professional instead. She told me I was being dismissive. We went in circles for 3 weeks. Then she agreed to try couples counseling. I thought that was a breakthrough. It wasn't. Because Nicole didn't go to counseling to fix anything. She went to build a record of trying. I didn't see that until much later. The therapist we saw was a perfectly decent woman who had no idea she was being used as set decoration for a narrative that had already been written. After 6 sessions, Nicole told me the counseling wasn't working. I asked what wasn't working. She said, "I just don't feel like you're really present." I had attended every session. I had done every exercise. I had filled out every reflection worksheet. But I wasn't present. I started to feel something shift in me around that point. Not anger, not grief, something colder. Clarity. I called my attorney, Victor, around that same time. Not to file anything, just to understand my position. Victor has handled real estate transactions for me for almost a decade. He's also one of the sharpest people I know when it comes to asset structuring. I told him what was happening. He listened without interrupting, which is one of his best qualities. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "You haven't done anything yet, and that's good. But you need to know what's on the table before anything moves." He walked me through it. The house was in my name, purchased before the marriage. My investment properties, 3 of them, were also premarital assets, but 2 had appreciated significantly during the marriage. My business interest in the acquisitions firm I co-founded was partially built during the marriage. Nicole had never worked at the firm. She had not invested in it. She had not contributed to it in any operational way. But under North Carolina's equitable distribution rules, the marital increase in value of premarital assets could be considered marital property. That number, depending on how aggressively an opposing attorney pushed, could be significant. Victor said 2 words to me after laying all of that out. Start planning. I want to be clear about something. At this point, I still hadn't decided to end the marriage. I was planning in case it ended. There's a difference. I still came home every evening. I still had dinner with Nicole most nights. I still asked about her day and listened to her answers. But I had also begun a quiet, methodical process of understanding exactly what I had built and exactly how to protect it. I'm not going to apologize for that. Any reasonable person in that position would do the same. The difference is that most people wait until the papers are filed to start thinking about it. By then, it's too late. Victor introduced me to a specialist named Dennis. Dennis worked specifically in asset protection trusts and had a reputation for being thorough in a way that made opposing counsel very unhappy. We met 3 times over the course of about 6 weeks. He explained something to me that I had heard of but never fully understood. A domestic asset protection trust, structured correctly and established well in advance of any legal action, could shield a significant portion of premarital and legitimately separate assets from equitable distribution claims. The key phrase was well in advance. There are fraudulent conveyance rules that prevent you from transferring assets into a trust the moment divorce papers are filed. But if the trust was established during the marriage, during a period of apparent normalcy, and if the transfer of assets into it was documented as part of a broader estate planning strategy rather than a reactive divorce play, it could withstand scrutiny. This wasn't a loophole. This was legal estate planning, the kind of thing wealthy families do quietly every single day. I had simply never thought I needed to do it. Nicole's family had reminded me that I did. While I was meeting with Dennis, something else was happening at home. Nicole had been talking more and more about her future. Not our future. Her future. She started using phrases like, "when I have my own space," and "once I figure out what I actually want." She stopped asking about my work. She stopped asking about weekend plans more than a day in advance. She was already living in a transitional state in her own mind. I noticed all of it. I said very little. I kept coming home. I kept being present in the way she claimed I wasn't. And I kept meeting with Victor and Dennis. About 4 months before Gerald's living room visit, Nicole told me her parents wanted to come for the weekend. I said that was fine. Gerald and Diane arrived on a Friday evening. Dinner was pleasant enough on the surface. Gerald talked about a new contract his company had landed. Diane talked about a trip they were planning. Nicole was animated in a way she hadn't been with me in months. Watching her with them was like watching someone breathe different air. Saturday was quieter. Nicole and Diane went shopping. Gerald and I sat on the back porch. He started talking about the housing market in a general way. Then he pivoted. "You know," he said, "Nicole has always been someone who needs a lot of emotional investment. Some men can provide that. Some can't. It doesn't mean they're bad people." I looked at him. "Are you saying I can't?" I asked. He shrugged in that way men do when they want to say yes without saying yes. "I'm just saying she's our daughter, and we want to see her happy." "So do I," I said. "Good," he said. Then maybe you should think about what that actually looks like. He got up and went inside. I sat on that porch for a long time. The following Monday, I called Victor. I told him to move forward with the trust structure Dennis had designed. Victor asked if I was sure. I said yes. He told me the timing needed to look organic. He suggested framing it as part of a broader estate planning review triggered by a change in my business valuation. That was accurate, by the way. My firm had recently been approached about a partial acquisition by a regional investment group. It created a legitimate reason to re-examine my entire financial structure. Dennis began the process of drafting the trust documents. Victor began the process of what he called cleaning up the equity story on the investment properties. 2 of the 3 properties had a complex ownership situation from when I'd briefly considered bringing in a partner years earlier. We formalized the documentation to clarify my sole ownership stake. Everything was above board. Everything was documented. Everything was time-stamped. A month later, Nicole told me she wanted to talk. We sat at the kitchen table. She had clearly rehearsed this. She told me she didn't think the marriage was working. She said she felt like we had grown in different directions. She said she hoped we could be mature about it. I asked her what mature meant to her. She said she hoped we could handle things amicably without things getting complicated. I asked what complicated meant. She said she meant financially. There it was. She wanted the conversation to be about how I would make this easy for her. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I said, I'm not going to do anything to make this harder than it needs to be. Which was true. I just also wasn't going to make it easier than it was. She seemed to interpret that as agreement. She called her mother that evening. I could hear her in the other room. She sounded relieved. That was the night I signed the trust transfer documents. Here is the part that matters. 6 years earlier, 2 months before our wedding, I had asked Nicole to sign a prenuptial agreement. She was upset about it initially. Her parents were more upset. Gerald had actually called me and told me that asking his daughter to sign a prenup was insulting to her and to their family. I told Gerald that it wasn't about trust, it was about clarity. He didn't accept that. Nicole eventually did. After several conversations, and after having her own attorney review it, she signed. The agreement was specific. It outlined that premarital assets remained separate property. It outlined that my business interests were classified as separate property regardless of appreciation during the marriage. It included a spousal support clause that waived temporary alimony in the event of divorce proceedings unless the marriage had lasted more than 10 years or unless Nicole could demonstrate that she was unable to meet her basic living expenses without assistance. We had been married 6 years. Nicole had a job. She was an assistant director of marketing for a mid-sized company. She made good money. Not my money, but good money. Her attorney had reviewed that clause specifically. It had been agreed to. It had been signed. I had kept a certified copy in a fireproof safe and a scanned copy in 3 separate secure cloud locations. Victor had the original. Now we get back to Gerald in my living room. It was a Saturday morning about 3 weeks after Nicole told me she wanted out. They arrived together, all 3 of them. Nicole, Gerald, and Diane. I made coffee. I offered breakfast. They declined. Gerald sat down across from me with the posture of a man who believed he was about to end something. Diane sat next to Nicole with her hand on Nicole's knee. Gerald looked at me and said it. We want you to know that Nicole doesn't have to stay in this marriage if she's unhappy. Diane added, we're prepared to support her through this. She won't be left without resources. Nicole looked at me with something between guilt and resolution. I nodded. I looked at all 3 of them calmly. I said, I appreciate you being direct. And that was all. They seemed to expect more. A protest. An argument. Begging. I gave them nothing. The silence unnerved them. Diane tried to fill it. This isn't about anyone being a bad person, she said. It's just about what Nicole needs. I understand, I said. Gerald studied me for a moment. You're taking this very calmly, he said. Would you prefer I didn't? I asked. He didn't answer. They left about 40 minutes later. Nicole stayed. She asked me if I was okay. I told her I was fine. She said, I didn't ask them to come. I said, I know. I don't actually know if that was true, but it didn't matter anymore. The trust documents were already signed. The equity transfers were already filed. My attorney already had the prenuptial agreement ready for the courtroom. The next move was hers. She filed 3 weeks later. I was served at my office on a Tuesday afternoon. My assistant brought the envelope in with a look of genuine concern. I thanked her, set the envelope aside, finished the call I was on, and then opened it. I read through the petition. Nicole was requesting equitable distribution of marital assets. She was requesting temporary alimony, pending the finalization of the divorce. She was requesting that the court consider her reasonable financial needs, given the lifestyle established during the marriage. Her attorney, a woman named Caroline who had a reputation for aggressive temporary relief motions, had already filed a motion for emergency temporary support. I called Victor. He said, "I saw it. We're ready." I asked about the trust. He said it had been fully established and funded for over 60 days, well before the filing, with clean documentation tied to the business valuation event. I asked about the prenup. He said it was airtight. I asked him what he actually thought would happen. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think they're about to be very surprised." The temporary alimony hearing was scheduled for about 5 weeks after the filing. In the weeks between, Nicole's attorney sent a series of aggressive discovery requests. They wanted full financial disclosure on every asset I held. Victor responded appropriately and completely. Every asset was disclosed. The trust was disclosed. The equity transfers were disclosed. Everything was on the table. Caroline clearly expected to find hidden assets or sloppy documentation. What she found instead was a financial structure that had been established with extraordinary care over a period of many months, with documentation that told a clean and coherent story. The trust was real. The estate planning rationale was real. The business valuation trigger was real. There was nothing to attach. I want to address something honestly here. Some people, when they hear this kind of story, assume the husband must have been doing something wrong. That legal financial planning is inherently suspicious. I want to push back on that. I built everything I had over 15 years of early mornings, calculated risks, and decisions that most people would not have had the discipline to make. I did not build it dishonestly. I did not hide it. I disclosed everything completely. What I did was understand the law and use every legitimate tool it offered me. If Nicole had consulted a financial advisor 6 years ago and structured her own separate accounts and investment portfolio, I would have respected that completely. The fact that she didn't is not my responsibility. The fact that her parents promised her financial support she hadn't actually verified was her responsibility. And her problem. The prenuptial agreement was the cornerstone of the temporary alimony hearing. Caroline attacked it on 2 grounds. First, she argued that Nicole had signed it under duress given the proximity to the wedding. The problem with that argument was that Nicole had signed the agreement with the advice of her own independent attorney 2 full months before the wedding. The attorney she had used at the time submitted an affidavit confirming the process had been thorough and voluntary. Caroline's second argument was that the support waiver clause was unconscionable because Nicole's current financial needs exceeded what was reasonably foreseeable at the time of signing. The problem with that argument was Nicole's income. She made a solid salary. She had savings. She had a car that was paid off. She had no dependents. There was no emergency. There was only expectation. The expectation that because she had lived a comfortable life during our marriage, she was entitled to continue living that life at my expense while divorcing me. The judge was not moved. I was present in the courtroom when the ruling came down. I watched Nicole's face. I watched Caroline's face. I watched the moment that the judge denied the temporary alimony motion and referenced the signed prenuptial agreement as binding and enforceable. Nicole went very still. Caroline leaned over and whispered something to her. Nicole shook her head slightly. After the hearing, I walked out with Victor. In the hallway, I heard Nicole on her phone. She was calling her mother. Her voice had that particular pitch it gets when something has genuinely shocked her. I didn't stop to listen. I had a meeting to get back to. What happened after is something I was told about secondhand. Nicole had apparently gone to her parents' house that evening. She told them about the ruling. She told them about the prenuptial agreement clause. She told them that temporary alimony had been denied. Gerald and Diane had apparently believed they understood the financial landscape going into this. They had apparently been under the impression that the house, the investment properties, and a significant portion of the business interest would all be on the table for equitable distribution. They had assumed that temporary alimony would provide Nicole with an income bridge while the divorce proceeded. They had promised her support based on what they believed she would receive. They had not, apparently, consulted their own attorney before making those promises. Because if they had, someone might have thought to ask Nicole whether there was a prenuptial agreement. And if there was a prenuptial agreement, whether she had read it recently. The calls started going unanswered about 2 weeks after the hearing. Not my calls. Nicole's calls to her parents. She mentioned it to me once, briefly, during a civil exchange about logistics. She said, "My parents have been hard to reach." I said, That's frustrating. She looked at me, and I think she was waiting for me to say something more. I didn't. I already knew what was happening. Gerald and Diane had made a promise they couldn't keep. They had told their daughter that she would be fine, that they would support her, that she didn't need to stay in a marriage that wasn't giving her everything she wanted. And they had meant it, right up until it became clear that the financial outcome they had anticipated wasn't materializing. Gerald's company was not doing well. They had a mortgage on a house that had lost some value. The support they had promised had been budgeted against assets that were never going to be Nicole's. When the prenuptial agreement held, when the trust structure held, when the equity transfers held, the math of their promise fell apart. They didn't stop returning her calls out of malice. They stopped because they were embarrassed. And because supporting Nicole through a prolonged divorce that wasn't going the way anyone had planned was a different conversation than telling her to leave over coffee in my living room. There's a version of this story where I'm the villain. I know that. I've told it to myself. The version where I'm a cold, calculating man who saw his marriage falling apart and responded by building legal walls instead of trying harder to save something real. I've sat with that version. I've given it genuine consideration. And here's what I come back to. I did try. I went to counseling. I asked questions. I stayed present. I kept coming home. I never stopped trying to have a real conversation about what Nicole actually needed versus what her parents had convinced her she deserved. The planning I did was not instead of trying to save the marriage. It was alongside it. Because I had learned something important. When someone tells you they love you, but their actions are entirely oriented toward what they can take from you, you cannot love your way out of that situation. You can only protect what's yours while remaining honest and decent. Which is what I did. The full divorce proceedings took another 8 months. Caroline pushed hard on every front. The trust was challenged twice. Victor defended it twice. The equity documentation was examined in detail. It held. The prenuptial agreement remained the governing document for the support question throughout. Nicole received her share of what was genuinely marital property, which was modest. She received a fair division of the joint savings account. She received the joint vehicle. She received a portion of the household furnishings. What she did not receive was the house. What she did not receive was a stake in the investment properties. What she did not receive was a claim against the business. What she did not receive was ongoing spousal support. On the day the divorce was finalized, I sat in Victor's office and he handed me the final decree. He shook my hand. He said, "You handled this about as well as it can be handled." I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be clear about that. There's nothing about losing a marriage that feels like a win. Even when you're not the one who chose to end it. Even when you protected what you built. Even when the other side walked into a courtroom expecting one outcome and got another. You're still sitting in an attorney's office holding a piece of paper that says something you built is over. That's not a victory. That's just survival. About 3 weeks after the finalization, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something made me pick up. It was Gerald. He called from his cell phone instead of his home line, which I had blocked months earlier. He didn't say hello. He said, "I need to talk to you about Nicole." I said, "She's your daughter and she's an adult, and this is no longer something I'm involved in." He was quiet. Then he said, "She's struggling. Financially." I said, "I'm sorry to hear that." He paused. I was wondering if there was any possibility of. I said, "Gerald, you sat in my living room and told me you were prepared to support her. I remember your exact words." He didn't say anything. Whatever that plan looked like, I said, "I hope it works out." And I ended the call. I want to be honest about Nicole for a moment. Because this story isn't about a villainous woman. Nicole is not a bad person. She is someone who grew up in a family where her parents' voices were the loudest thing in the room, and she never fully developed the internal mechanism to question them. She married me, and, for a while, that worked. I was stable in a way she found comforting. But her parents were never comfortable with me because I was not impressionable. I didn't need their validation. I didn't need Gerald's financial opinions or Diane's approval of how I furnished my home. I think that threatened something in their family dynamic. And so they chipped away at the marriage from the outside until it crumbled from the inside. Nicole was the instrument of that, but she was also a victim of it in her own way. She ended up, by the end of it all, with a settlement that was fair but not generous. With parents who had made promises they couldn't keep. And with the realization, I imagine, that the life she had left was not as replaceable as she had been told. I don't feel satisfaction about any of that. I feel something closer to sadness. But sadness doesn't mean regret. I did what I needed to do. The business acquisition that had provided the legitimate trigger for the estate planning review, it closed 6 months after the divorce. I sold a 30% stake to the regional investment group at a valuation that, had the divorce proceeded differently, would have been catastrophic to fight over in court. Instead, the proceeds went directly into the trust structure that had been in place for the better part of a year. Clean. Documented. Beyond reach. Victor called me after the closing. He was uncharacteristically warm. He said, "You know, most clients come to me after the disaster. You came before it." I told him I had been in commercial real estate long enough to know that you never wait until the structure is collapsing to check the foundation. He laughed. It was a good day. I moved out of the Charlotte house about 4 months after the divorce. Not because of any legal requirement. I owned it outright. I moved because I didn't want to sleep in rooms that had become archives of someone else's unhappiness. I sold it. The proceeds went into my personal accounts. The sale was clean. Nicole had no claim on it. I bought a smaller place about 20 minutes away. Less square footage. Better light. A kitchen I actually use. And silence that feels like mine instead of silence that feels like a conversation no one will finish. Somewhere around month 6 after the finalization, I had dinner with a colleague who knew some of the broad strokes of what had happened. He asked me if I had any regrets. I thought about it for a real moment before answering. I said I regretted not seeing the pattern earlier. Not the Gerald and Diane pattern. My own pattern. The way I had responded to the early warning signs by becoming quieter and more strategic instead of more direct. There was a version of this story where I have a genuinely honest conversation with Nicole in year 3, when I first started to see what her parents were doing, and we either address it together or we make a different decision together at that point. Instead, I managed it. I managed my awareness of the problem. I managed my exposure to it. I planned around it. And somewhere in all that managing and planning, the marriage became something to navigate rather than something to inhabit. That part is on me. Not the financial decisions. Those were sound. But the choice to go quiet instead of going direct, earlier, when it might have changed something. That's the one thing I do differently. I don't have a tidy moral to this. I'm not going to tell you that nice guys finish last, or that the system rewards the prepared. I'm not going to perform wisdom about trust and love and what they're really worth. What I'll tell you is this. When you build something over 15 years of disciplined work and real sacrifice, you have the right to protect it. Not by being dishonest, not by being vindictive, but by being smart, by understanding the tools that exist and using them correctly and completely, and by understanding that silence, in the right context, is not weakness. Sometimes silence is just the sound of someone making their last 3 phone calls before the other side thinks the conversation has even started. Gerald stopped calling after that one attempt. Diane sent a text message to my old number about 2 months after the divorce, a number I had ported to a different carrier. I never saw the message until I was going through old records. It said, "I hope you know what you did to our family." I read it once. I deleted it. And I thought about that sentence for a moment. What I did to their family. I worked hard for 15 years. I bought a house. I built a business. I married their daughter with a ceremony and a legally binding agreement that she signed with full knowledge. I went to counseling when asked. I planned carefully when warned. I stayed calm when threatened. I let the legal system do exactly what it was designed to do. What I did to their family was refuse to be the passive recipient of a plan that was built on someone else's assumptions about my compliance. That's all I did. Nicole and I have not spoken since about 4 months after the finalization. The last communication was an email about a piece of mail that had been incorrectly forwarded. Professional. Brief. She said thank you at the end. I said of course. That was it. I don't know where she is now. I don't know if she's okay. I hope she is. I genuinely hope she built something that works for her. I hope she learned which voices in her life are actually in her corner and which ones are only there when the math makes sense. There's one more thing. A few months after the divorce, I was having a drink at a place near my new house when I ran into someone I knew vaguely from a real estate networking event a few years back. We talked for a while. He was also divorced, a few years out. He asked about mine. I gave him the short version. He nodded. Then he said something I've thought about since. He said, "The thing about people who underestimate you is that they always tell you exactly when they're doing it. You just have to be paying attention." I thought about Gerald in my living room, sitting across from me with the coffee I made, telling me calmly and confidently that Nicole didn't have to stay, that they were prepared to support her, that I was being handled. And I thought about the 3 phone calls I had already made that morning. He was right. They always tell you. You just have to be paying attention. The trust is still active. The investment properties are performing well. The business interest, now restructured post-acquisition, is more valuable than it has ever been. The house I sold at a number that would have started a war in a courtroom sold quietly and cleanly with zero dispute. I have a good attorney, a good advisor, and a good trustee. I have work that I find genuinely meaningful. I have the kind of quiet that comes from having made clean decisions in a complicated situation. Not perfect decisions. Clean ones. That's all anyone can really ask for. If you take anything from this, take the part before all the legal strategy. The part where I started keeping a log. The part where I called Victor to understand my position before anything was irreversible. The part where I looked at the pattern around me with honest eyes instead of the eyes I wished were accurate. You don't have to be cynical to be prepared. You don't have to be cold to be clear. You just have to be honest with yourself about what you're actually looking at. Even when, especially when, looking directly at it is the hardest possible thing. I'm going to pour another coffee now. The kitchen in my new place has better light. The silence here is the right kind. And the foundation? I checked it before I moved in. It's solid.